Kia ora and welcome to the Niggly Nichecast with myself, Mr. Slippers, the Peptide Panther, delivering the South Auckland Doosra here with the Wobbly Wildcard, and we are going to be doing a bit of chat about BJ Watling for the bulk of this podcast. He's retired from the cricket thing at the highest level, so it's going to be a BJ Watling podcast. Prepare for it. We'll do a bit of housekeeping at the start with some Kiwi sports business, and then we'll crack on to BJ Watling. Early in the week, we record the Niche Variety Show, which is a bit more mix and match. So if you haven't checked that out, do check it out. And on the Patreon this week, we got a bit of a comparison between New Zealand Warriors and New Orleans Pelicans, trying to fit different pieces into those teams. Obviously, you got Reece Walsh and the Warriors spine, just trying to put those pieces together. Then you got Steven Adams and Zion Williamson trying to put those pieces together as well. So we talked through that on our Patreon podcast this week. So if you are a Patreon of the Niche Case, check that out on the Patreon feed. And if you're not a Patreon of the Niche Case, it is the best way to support us and support what we're doing. So join up the Patreon, and yeah, that's just the number one straight up the guts, front pad, front bat, forward defensive shot from BJ Watling. That's the straight up and down best way to support the Niche Case. Tomorrow's Friday, which means there's an email coming out via our Substack. Those are coming out Mondays and Fridays. And of course, we're always writing about Kiwi sports at the niche-case.com. Wobbly Wildcard, what have you got glad wrapped by mindfulness there?
It had better be glad wrapped well, because we're dipping way back into history here, into the tipping all the way back into the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure canon with old mate Socrates. Socrates once said that the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Bit of a beginner's mindset as well as the obvious there. If you know nothing, you're always learning, aren't you?
Certainly so. It's one of those ones that I think I try to remind myself more often. Like, the more you, even then, like at the beginning, that's the case, and then at the other end, that's the case, because, I mean, for one thing, there is no end, because I guess knowledge is probably an infinite potential. So there's always more to learn, and no matter how much you know, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what, like, the quantities of knowledge that are out there that you still have absolutely no clue about. So, in comparison, effectively, nothing. And that's a worthy one to, I guess it's a humbling, isn't it, is the process there.
Can I tell you some things I don't know, Wildcard?
Absolutely.
I don't know what's going to happen with Shaun Johnson. And I also don't know what's going to happen with Jamayne Isaako. Shaun Johnson's the bigger, more fun thing here. Jamayne Isaako slightly less. So I'll just do a bit on Isaako, then I'll ask you for Shaun Johnson, because Isaako is the current Broncos fullback. He's from Christchurch. He's played for the Kiwis a few times. Also got that Samoan link. And he's the Brisbane Broncos fullback right now. And I'm just fascinated to see what happens with him at the Broncos. He's got the skills and ability, I believe, to be the Brisbane Broncos fullback. But no one seems to think he will be the Brisbane Broncos fullback. And I just don't know. I just don't know what's going to happen with Jamayne Isaako. But it is a fascinating exercise in his little context, his little scenario. Obviously, he's a pretty major Kiwi NRL player as well. Not quite as major as SJ7, though. Maybe SJ6. Let me just check the team list this week, because he does chop and change between SJ7 and SJ6. He is SJ6 with Chad Townsend number 7 for the Sharks. Obviously, the Sharks are an absolute just caca at the moment, and a lot of this stuff just starts at ownership and the front office and works its way down to putting the team in a weird position. I'll link it to Tim Seifert here. Last 6 months have been pretty tough for Tim Seifert, as I mentioned on the Variety Show. Dip in form over the Caribbean Premier League, then the Super Smash, and he had a pretty crappy series against Australia in the T20 Internationals. Then he goes to India, doesn't play an IPL game, gets COVID. That's a tough period for a human being. Shaun Johnson, he got injured Achilles, I think it was, maybe end of last season. And then this season's a write-off because of stuff he's got no control over at the club. Like, the club's just being run in a very strange way, and it's completely derailed the Sharks season. And it's just a very tough period for Shaun Johnson and, of course, a lot of those other Sharks. Shaun Johnson's also looking for a contract. Fascinating time for him. How are you feeling about Shaun Johnson just coming straight off the top of your dome there?
I don't really... I must also be wise on the matter, because I also don't know really how I feel about Shaun Johnson. Like, I don't know if I've actually watched the Sharks game since he came back, so I couldn't even speak on, at least not fully through, I couldn't even speak on, like, how he's looking as a player and how that audition is going, if he's having to, like, open up to other clubs and whatever. It's an odd situation to be in for a player like him. I guess it is deliberately coming, like, not deliberately, but it's not a coincidence it's coming after an extreme injury, because that is going to lead to caution from both himself in terms of what he wants to, like, what his next move is going to be. It leads to caution from the Sharks and wanting to see what he looks like when he comes back before thinking about re-signing, and it leads to extreme caution for other teams who might be courting him, because they don't even have the inside word that the Sharks have dealing with him and their medical team and stuff. So it's not an easy situation to be in, but I suppose you only got to look as far as, like, his old mate Benji Marshall to find a little bit of inspiration on how, like, you can play yourself out of the situation that you might be in right now pretty quickly. Like, it doesn't take that much to just, get a few of them try assists that he was clocking up last year, and a few games in a row be an influential presence, and then suddenly the talk changes very quickly. It's one thing that you definitely learn quickly in the sports media landscape, is that the talk of today isn't necessarily the talk of tomorrow.
Interesting comparison there with Benji. The thing there is that Benji has had an upward swing. So Shaun Johnson might have an upward swing. Like, maybe this is just the Benji Marshall going to rugby union phase of Shaun Johnson's career. Because they were both very hot very early on, and they maintained a pretty high level over, like, the first maybe third of their career, first stanza of their career. Then you've got the Benji Marshall rugby union period where it's a bit tough, bit niggly, end of his Tigers days, just coming back and all that stuff. But then he's in a very resurgent patch, and I'm thinking, like, coming back to the Kiwis, captaining the Kiwis, then going on to the Rabbitohs. Shaun Johnson's plight is heading in the other direction, just like what he's been through recently. So, like, I am curious. I don't know where he's going to play next year. I don't know how he's going to play this year, because there isn't much doing with the Sharks. So it'll be very interesting there. Just a bit on the Warriors here. They are playing the Eels this weekend on Sunday. The Warriors could win this game, and it's going to be, again, I don't know how this game is going to unfold or what kind of Warriors version is going to show up. The Sharks Eels are missing Maratani Okori and Dylan Brown, which is similar to Manly Seagulls last week. They were playing without Marty Tapau and Josh Alloway, except the Manly forwards just stood up and barnstormed their way through the Warriors for much of that game. So I don't know how much weight that holds now with the Eels, but feels like a game the Warriors could win. So I don't know what's going to happen there. I just feel like it's a game they could win. And I also, wildcard, I don't know, and I want to know more a bit about Bill Tuiloma and Joe Bell with the Flying Kiwis, because they've both had some pretty cool headline-grabbing moments. This is your chance to kind of lay out some deeper context just on those two players specifically. Bill Tuiloma is in the US of A. Joe Bell is somewhere in Scandinavia, I believe, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, Norway. Bill Tuiloma's situation is they are different situations there. Like, they were the two leading examples in this week's Flying Kiwis, so, but coming about it in different ways. Bill Tuiloma has been similar to what he was last year. Like at the Portland Timbers, he's kind of seen as like the next man up defensively off the bench. Like he's not necessarily in the first 11, but he's getting games in rotated 11s and coming off the bench late on in situations. There have been a few of those rotated 11s, so he's getting a couple decent games over the last few weeks because Portland had been playing in the North American version of the Champions League. They just got knocked out of it. He started in their second leg of their quarterfinal against Club America from Mexico. They didn't do especially well in that game, but he got himself 90 minutes, and then they come back. He's back on the bench for their next MLS game, which was against Seattle, whatever they call themselves, Seattle Sounders, and they got, I won't say smoked, but they were comfortably beaten by their sort of like Pacific Northwest rivals there, and it wasn't fantastic. But Tuiloma on the bench ended up coming on in the 15th minute because it was Luis Mabiala got injured. I'll have to check if I haven't actually looked to see the extent of that because they hadn't updated anything after the game while I was writing about it. But he ended up, because of that, getting a hefty old appearance a few days after playing in the Champions League there. Played pretty well, had quite a few like little sort of stepping up and intercepting the ball moments. He's good in the air, so that's always handy. But the highlight moment was right at the end, stoppage time. Whips in a free kick, scores a absolute beauty. I don't even know who he had to crawl over to get to actually like take the free kick. He wouldn't have been the first guy that you necessarily would have thought would be on that list, but I guess maybe he's been just pummeling them in trainings, and the fellas, they knew it was coming. I won't say that the Seattle wall was especially well set. It sort of looked like if it hit about two, if maybe even three of those guys, the shot would have had to be off target anyway, so it wasn't too hard to kill it around them, but he hit it beautifully, scored an amazing goal. They still lost, but the stocks do seem to be up. We'll see if Mabiala's injured, then maybe he comes straight into the starting lineup for a decent run of games. Either way, like, he's definitely made a good case for himself with that one, and Joe Bell is also making a good case for himself in Norway. It was the first game of their season. They were playing against, I think it's Brann. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but like 17, 18 minutes into the game or something like that, there's a loose ball in the midfield. He gets his foot on it, steps around through pressure and up, carries the ball into the attacking third, slips it with the outside of his right boot to a forward peeling off to his right side into the box. Fella shoots, fella scores. So nice sneaky assist for Joe Bell there early on. They ended up winning 3-0, and he actually played a part in all three of their goals, which is pretty excellent coming from a midfielder, like, to be that involved. Not necessarily, like, he didn't get another assist, but you could, like, watching the goals back, he wasn't making an important pass or feeding the ball forward or something like that. So, all pretty, like, this is his second season with FC Viking in Norway. It's the, I guess, second season you sort of expect him to make some, like, to have taken stock over the off-season, looked at the areas where he can improve to look to step things up. He played almost every game for them in this first season, so he was coming straight in and doing good things. But I suppose if you're looking for an area where he might improve, it would be the fact he scored 2 goals and had 3 assists over 28, 29 games or whatever it was he played last year. Already with an assist early on, looking like he can provide a few more of those. So if he gets that, like, that attacking output going, as well as already being a pretty solid, dependable defensive midfielder, sky's the limit. Like, that's the kind of form that gets you noticed by scouts. Like, that's the sort of form that will get you mentioned in transfer rumors and stuff like that. And you'll pop up in articles when they're like 10 undercover signings that Arsenal or Chelsea could make this summer kind of thing. Like, there might not be truth behind it, but you get the mills churning and see what happens. Libby Kikache has already been, like, swept up into that a little bit with the link to Juventus that he had a while back. Joe Bell definitely looks like, if he can play like that more often than not, he is going to get himself in a fair few conversations similar to that. So that's pretty bloody exciting for what that means for his career. Also spent some time on Twitter around the time of doing Flying Kiwis, chatting with a chatting with a fan group who had put up a video of a song they was like a chant that they had recorded from last season for Joe Bell, which was just like to the tune of Dolly Parton's Jolene singing Joe Bell, Joe Bell, Joe Bell, Joe Bell, something yada 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 yada. And I like went to see if they might translate it because Google had absolutely no idea what they were doing with the Norwegian language, and it came out like Joe Bell, Joe Bell, Joe Bell, Joe Bell. You have curly hair, but we like you anyway, or something along those lines, which I don't... There might be something lost in translation. I'm not sure if Norwegians just don't like curly-haired people. They assured me that wasn't the case, but either way, as I tweeted with the initial chant, I don't... It's not 100% on the lyrics, but definitely passes the vibes test, and it's just pretty cool to see that kind of like... To see a young Kiwi footballer swept up in like the European football fan culture like that is pretty awesome.
Yes or no answer, is Joe Bell in your favourite like first 11 All Whites, full strength All Whites first 11 team?
Oh yeah, like he's maybe the third or fourth name on the list. Like Chris Wood's coming in first. Ryan Thomas, fully fit, is there. Winston Reid, fully fit, is there. Maybe Michael Boxall sneaks in ahead of him as well. I don't know. Sarpreet Singh's also in that conversation. Like, most of the first 11 probably takes care of itself at this point. I don't know that there's a couple of spots, like mostly the, I think right back maybe is up for grabs, and I think the two winger spots up front in Danny Hayes 4-3-3 would be up for grabs. And I noticed Callum McCallum got a couple goals for Helsingør this since the last Flying Kiwis, so that'll be in the next one. That's always nice to see. But yeah, Joe Bell absolutely is a first 11 player for the All Whites.
Cowabunga. Well, let's go talk a bit of BJ Watling here. You wrote about BJ Watling retiring, and it was basically an outline of just his greatness. And there were a lot of statistics in that. So if you do want to have a gaze at BJ Watling's statistics and whatever other angles the wildcard wrote in that, check that out. Because here we're not going to dwell too much on the BJ Watling statistics, because there's also a lot of stuff that isn't statistical that also basically just outlines BJ Watling's greatness. So if you want the stat vibe, go read about it on the website. Here we're just going to talk about BJ Watling, just the legend. He is the greatest at what he does. And there's plenty to chat through. I'm going to start here with a bit of a scorecard check wildcard. Cricinfo, every cricketer's, well, most, because I clicked through to Jesse Ryder's Cricinfo profile and his debut games weren't listed. So most cricketers do have their debuts listed on the Cricinfo, and you just like go down memory lane and see when they debuted, who was playing and whatnot. So a little bit of a scorecard check here for BJ Watling. His first 4-dayer was in 2004. His first 1-dayer was in 2004. These are games for Northern District, so it's first class list A T20, and his first T20 game was 2007. Other players to debut alongside BJ Watling in these games: T20, Scott Golder. No idea who the fuck he is. 1-dayers, Daniel Flynn. He retired from all cricket last year, 2020. So that just puts BJ Watling into some perspective. And then Graham Murray, also no idea who the fuck he is. 4-dayer, Ryan Shute. Shutte. No idea who he is, but they all made their respective format debuts alongside BJ Watling. The 4-dayer, BJ Watling was playing against Mark Richardson, Matt Horn, Lou Vincent, Brooke Walker, the leggy. He was playing alongside Daryl Tuffy and all those ND legends. If you know your cricket, you know who those legends are: Jovic, Aldridge, Butler, Bruce Martin, the Marshalls, the Hearts, all those characters. His 1-day debut, he was playing against Chris Nevin. Jesse Ryder, young Jesse Ryder was there. And then his T20 debut, he played alongside Andrew Strauss. Andrew Strauss was opening the batting in that game. And yeah, that's about all the funky names there. This sets up like BJ Watling's entrance into cricket. And what's interesting, Wildcard, is that he was not the wicketkeeper in 2 of those games. So Peter McGlashan was the wicketkeeper in the one-dayer and the 2020. BJ Watling was the wicketkeeper in the 4-dayer, and in the 4-dayer, he batted way down the order as a wicketkeeper, pretty much the same position that Peter McGlashan otherwise would. So like-for-like placement there. But then James Marshall is absent, hurt in the second innings, so BJ Watling opens that innings. So you've got BJ Watling in 2 of his 3 domestic debuts. He was not the wicketkeeper. He was just the batsman. And now we're reflecting on the greatest wicketkeeper batsman New Zealand's ever had, and someone who's, Kiwis are going to vouch for him in the greatest ever all-time international ranks as well. How do you process all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you, but I don't have to because you've already said it. Like, there's no doubting that he's New Zealand's best Test wicketkeeper. Like, I ran through some stats in that piece you mentioned before, which people can look at to see like how he basically, in every category you might come up with, he is outdone. Like, he's not just putting up a case. He's number 1 in every category, like runs scored and also batting average and games played, definitely innings captain. He will overtake Perori for games played if he plays all 3 games in England, which of course he will. What are you going to do? Rest him when he's going to retire in a month's time? Like, no dramas there. And same with the actual wicket-keeping stuff. Like, more dismissals than anyone else by miles and at a better ratio, like, of dismissals per innings. So I don't think there's any doubting his standings for New Zealand. And I mean, I sort of wrote in that thing, like, it's a little bit easy to forget that opening batsman specific thing, like, carried on into the international fold. Like, before he was a Test match wicketkeeper, he was like a one-day opening batsman and opened the batting in Tests a few times alongside, I think it was Tim McIntosh and one game with Martin Guptill, and didn't do so well there. It wasn't ideal for him. But like, that was his introduction to international cricket and made him an all-format player as well. And I guess for the most part for Northern, he would also have been, like, not just in his debuts, I guess for quite a few years, Peter McGlashan still would have been the first choice keeper ahead of him as well. And McGlashan was a very good keeper too. And I guess that's the thing with Watling, because people are reflecting on his career now that he's announced that he's retiring in a couple months. Like, that story's being told a little bit more about, this guy wasn't even a wicketkeeper when he first got to international cricket, but he just wasn't a full-time wicketkeeper. Like, he knew how to keep. He'd kept plenty of times before, and he'd kept in first-class games and all this before he played for the Black Caps. Certainly before he kept for the Black Caps. But I think maybe, like, it's not the transition that he went from batsman to wicketkeeper. It's not quite like the Mark Richardson story where he was a spin bowler and a lower order batsman who transformed himself into an opening batter because he just thought he might be able to do that. Like, it's not that vast of a transition. The crazy thing with BJ Watling is just how good it was, though. Like, he didn't just become a passable Test match wicketkeeper. Like, there are plenty of good keepers around the world who we've seen in recent years who are excellent batsmen, maybe not quite as good with the gloves. England go through heaps of them. Like, all of England's wicketkeeper batsmen are really good batsmen who aren't fantastic glovemen. We just had old Mushi from Bangladesh, Mushfiqur Rahim, come in here, and he hasn't kept in Test matches. I was looking this up when I was writing. He hasn't kept in Test matches since 2019. Very good reason for that, because he's a great batsman who is terrible and drops a lot of, with the gloves, and drops a lot of catches. We saw that in the one days, dropped a lot of catches and didn't cover himself in glory as a gloveman. BJ Watling was fantastic at, like, he was a near flawless keeper. Like he didn't hardly drop anything. He gobbled the he took some excellent catches as well. He wasn't quite as like dynamically athletic as someone like Brendan McCullum, but you know, he did everything. He he didn't have to take a lot of stumpings, I'll say. That's one aspect, but maybe less to do with BJ Watling and more to do with the quality of spinners that he played with. I think he took 8 stumpings all up, and 5 of them were off the bowling of Mark Craig. And if Mitchell Santner's been the majority, like the main spinner that he's probably played with, Santner's not really one to spin the ball past the edge and catch a batsman out of their grounds. So, like, that's more par for the course. But like, who of his era is in like competition with BJ Watling as a fielder, as a wicket keeping fielder? Like, forget the batsman side of things. The fact that he was also an excellent batsman, one of the few guys who scored a double hundred as a designated keeper, like, that's fantastic. But then just, we already knew he was a good batsman because he was an opening batsman when he first got to international cricket. The fact he became not just a good solid keeper, but one of the very best in the world that's the crazy part of the BJ Watling story to me. Like, that's the most impressive, the biggest achievement there, I think. I mean, MS Dhoni obviously was an outrageously good keeper, quickest hands in the business, but there aren't that many others over that course of time who were as good as BJ Watling, which is like, that's the funky thing to me, is just not that he transitioned into becoming a good solid test keeper, but that he transitioned into becoming one of the very best test keepers in the world, and arguably the best one New Zealand ever had.
And it never felt like he was in a bad patch. Like, he was just always playing at a good level. I think some of the other wicket keepers around the world, they might have had more highs and lows and more drama or something like that. BJ Watling just stuck at a very high level for a long time and never really deviated from that level.
Yeah, I mean, he had runs where he'd go like a couple years without 100 or something like that, or he'd have a little drought without passing 50s, but he had the cheat code to that, because BJ Watling's whole thing was that the tougher the situation, the better he performs. Like, he wants to come in, well, not that he wants to, but that he was so good coming in. Can you, like, when we were growing up, the Black Caps were famous for second innings batting collapses. Like, this was just a thing that they did. Every now and then, they'd be in a really competitive game against a good team and get bowled out for 120 in the second innings or something like that, and just ruin everything. Like, all the good work disappears. Normally in the space of like one session or something like that, with most of the damage done. BJ Watling was like a one-man anti-collapse machine. Like, he's going to stick around, he's going to battle through the tough stuff, and he scored so many of his best runs in the most difficult situations. Like, I think his batting average goes up when the Black Caps lose the toss. His batting average goes up in, it might have been in second innings as well. I forget, I haven't got it in front of me, but things like that. And his home and away splits are pretty similar. Normally there's a fairly like significant jump towards the home team. Like, you just, for obvious reasons, like you make hay while the sun shines, you cash in when you're playing at home in familiar conditions. Watling just is, and I guess the best example of this is McCullum's 302, where he didn't, like, BJ Watling came into, India scored heaps in the first innings, we were way behind. He comes to the crease, I think it might have even been second innings, I forget, because I haven't got the scoreboard open, but we were like 94 for 5 or something like that. Next thing you know, world record partnership alongside Brendan McCullum, and tested match has been saved. Watling gets out after scoring 100. Jimmy Neesham comes in and scores 100 himself. McCullum goes on to get 302. Like, that's almost the archetypal BJ Watling situation, because you got everything that made him really good, like, as a batsman at least. Like, you had him battling against the odds, you had him, like, difficult situation against the tough team sort of thing. You also had, like, a really big partnership. He's one of only 14 players, I think, who have been involved in multiple 350-run partnerships. He's had one with McCullum and one with Kane Williamson. there's that. There's the fact that he went on and scored 100 as well, so just showing like the volume of runs. And then there's also the fact that he played one of the key roles, like one of the great moments in New Zealand cricket history would not have been possible without him. Not only that, but we also would have been probably losing that test match if he'd gotten out cheaply. But he also just didn't get the big, he didn't get the spotlight from that innings because obviously McCullum goes on and scores a triple century. He gets all the headlines. Which is almost perfect BJ Watling areas because he just gets to chill in the background knowing he did his thing for the team. You know what I mean?
And I think that points to his avant-garde nature. I think him and Neil Wagner just conducted themselves and continue to in a different way. The easy way to bottle this is their limited T20 cricket. We've grown up and experienced T20 cricket take over the cricketing world, and if you're a cricketing fan, it's taken over your cricketing life to a large extent. And everything I'm saying about BJ Watling, the same applies to Neil Wagner. I just won't, chuck Neil Wagner in there the whole time. For someone like Watling, his whole career goes against the grain and trend of the way cricket is being packaged and the direction it's heading. However, that didn't take anything away from BJ Watling, and I think we're kind of seeing this in the reaction and response to his retirement. This is a lot of respect and a lot of adulation for BJ Watling, and he's someone who didn't do anything to any great extent. When was his last couple of T20 games here? Last T20 for Northern Districts was 2017. So he's not really playing T20 cricket, and yet he gets his mana. His mana in New Zealand sport is what it is, and I think that's pretty cool and pretty interesting that there are these cricketers, and maybe if we thought about it more, there would be athletes in their respective sports who have, done their work as the greatest or the best or among the best of what they're doing without necessarily having to play into some of the other things of sports. I'm sure BJ Watling could really carve out some sort of T20 career if he wanted to. Skillful batsman. I imagine he could play 360 degrees, all the ramps, all the flicks, all that stuff. If he set his mind to it, based on everything he's done in his career, he could be quite the attacking batsman and quite a T20 batsman. But it didn't happen, and it just seems like he didn't want it to happen. He didn't really have time for that. He was content and comfortable with who he is and what he's done. And I think that kind of sums up the no stat angle to BJ Watling. He's the greatest statistically at what he does and who he is in New Zealand sport and cricket. He's also the greatest at being an avant-garde figure, someone who went a different path to the majority of cricketers around the world. And I think that's admirable, and it's even more epic when there's no impact. Him not playing T20 cricket didn't impact his mana or his standing in Kiwi sports fandom, which is even more amazing.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some kind of link, like a connection to the fact that he's from a South African immigrant family, and Neil Wagner's also one from an immigrant family. Neil Wagner came over much later himself. I don't know how old BJ Watling was when he came to New Zealand, but he was definitely born in South Africa, wasn't he? Neil Wagner came over as an adult, as an established cricketer at that point. But the fact that they both then sort of had careers and are still having careers, neither of them finished quite yet. I had trouble sticking to a tense in that article I wrote. Do I speak about BJ Watling's career in the past or in the current or whatever? Because he's announced his retirement, but he's not retired yet. He's still got 3 more games to play. But yeah, like just that do what it takes mentality. I wonder if that's part of it as well. Like they're both guys who obviously in other ways have made sacrifices to get where they got, and everyone does this to get to the top level in any sport. But I don't know. I wonder if there's some connection there. But like what you're saying about what you're saying before, like it's not that much different to a topic we touched on in the variety show, which is like Steven Adams could shoot more 3-pointers if he wanted to, but he doesn't. He plays the game in a certain way and tries to be the very best version of himself he can within that role, which is not necessarily the way that the game of basketball is going. Like, it's more and more 3-pointers. They want big guys who can stretch the court. He's not one of those, but he does that old school banging in the paint thing as well as anyone does these days, defensively at least, a little less so. His hands haven't been great this season. He's fumbling, he's missing a few that he could get and not quite gathering all his rebounds. I think he's probably stems more from the fact that he's had ankle injuries and isn't getting the lift he would hope. But that's off topic. Chris Wood could try and be more of a the type of striker that you see at top 6 clubs, where it's a lot more about movement off the ball and trying to get him behind the line and those kind of things. But that's not the way that he's used at Burnley, and it's not the way that he's made his name. He plays with his back to goal a lot, likes to link up with teammates running off of him and be a target man and those kind of things. It's old fashioned, but it works. You mentioned the example of Lydia Ko in the variety show. It's someone who isn't necessarily keeping up with the current trend of just like absolutely walloping it off the tee and just getting big driving distances. But she's one of the best putters in the world, and that more than makes up for that. Like there are a lot of other examples around of these same things, and BJ Watling fits in quite nicely to that kind of package, doesn't he? Where it's like he sort of picked a lane and he stuck with it, and he did absolutely like everything within his power to be the best version of that player that he could. Like he got to the point, and it's also funny because like, not funny, but it's just another interesting point of it is he wasn't like a 21, 22-year-old trying to get to the next level when he sort of fully dedicated himself to trying to be the Test wicketkeeper. Like he was 27, 28, 29. Like he was a borderline veteran domestic player at that point. They'd gone, because this all started after McCullum's knees basically were no longer willing to withstand the rigors of 5 days potentially out in the field. Like he couldn't keep anymore. He wanted to bat higher up in the order. The flip side is that Watling moved lower down in the order and decided to keep. As mentioned, like he wasn't a novice keeper or anything, but he did have to like become a specialist at that point. But he didn't take over immediately after McCullum. Like there was a year or two in there where you had Gareth Hopkins got a run of games, you had Reece Young got a run of games, and Kruger Van Wyk was the other one got a run of games. It was BJ Watling who made it stick, and I guess there's something to that about BJ Watling. Yeah, like he picked a lane and then he stuck to that lane and became the best version of that player that he could.
It is a odd little group of like hole plugging wicket keepers.
From memory, they had that problem after Perori too, I think, before McCullum sort of came. It wasn't, I think it was a shorter distance, but you did have a few other, like you often get that, and that's probably a point we can talk about in a sec as well, is that transition to the next keeper is actually quite, like the procession is already set for the Black Caps now, like don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, so like we're talking about literally the greatest wicketkeeper batsman New Zealand's had, and as crazy and harsh as this sounds, it won't have an impact on the Black Caps because he only plays Test cricket, and Tom Blundell is following the BJ Watling recipe to replace BJ Watling. Like it's all just going to be a smooth transition, smooth takeover in the format that BJ Watling plays, and we can I don't want to get too busy into like forecasting forward who's going to be the next wicketkeeper and all that kind of stuff, because we do have stuff in England coming up, and BJ Watling is still the dude. He's still the guy there. There's just so many little layers of weirdness here. Like, you do have Tom Blundell replicating what BJ Watling did, and you've got a very different situation to what you were kind of talking through there with Perori. So when Perori, like, it was a long time ago, but I don't really remember, like, the only wicketkeeper I knew was Perori. That's it. And then sometimes you'd see Chris Nevin pop up. And then Brendan McCullum just comes out of nowhere, because we weren't so deep in the cricket thing. We were just watching the Black Caps play. Brendan McCullum comes out of nowhere, and then as I got older, I started to learn a bit more about the cricket landscape, and then you start getting different domestic figures and those kind of jokers in. But it wasn't like there was like heaps of wicketkeepers putting pressure on Perori and competing, and even McCullum. Like, McCullum kind of just went straight into who he was and what he was offering the Black Caps, and he had a really quick impact. And because, like, you think back to that one-day series in Australia where it was like one of his first 5 games or something, and he impacted how the Black Caps would move forward from that point. Just like him being there had an impact, and then obviously you think about his long-term impact with the Black Caps as well. Both of those are very different to what we have now with BJ Watling, where you do have too many wicketkeepers. Like, you've got Blundell, Conway's a wicketkeeper, Glenn Phillips is a wicketkeeper and a bowler, Tim Seifert's there. Then you've got other like domestic wicketkeepers who will be in contention of what I'm saying down the track. You've got Dane Cleaver, you've got Cameron Fletcher with Canterbury. These, like, there's plenty of wicketkeepers who will be fizzing to put their best foot forward this coming summer, and then in the summers to come after that as well. It's a very different situation with what BJ Watling's had, and I don't know, like, obviously we've talked a bit about Black Caps culture and how they did bring in Tom Blundell a couple summers ago to get this kind of overlap and to get the cohesion in what they're doing. So I think it's a fair amount of it is planning and preparation for the next stage of the wicketkeeper role, but it is very different regardless of how it used to be, like thinking back in our cricketing journey.
Yeah, I looked up past Black Caps wicketkeepers, and there was like a transitional period after Perori. It wasn't like it was after McCullum. It was just a couple summers of Robbie Hart being the keeper until Brendan McCullum came through. He was the only keeper in between Perori's retirement and McCullum's first test. So that actually, that little sort of like, I don't know, primordial soup of Hopkins, Young, Watling, Van Wyk, and that's actually a bit of a, that looks even messier in hindsight looking at that. But that's the ingredients or whatever that that BJ Watling rose out of. So like that's what led to what happened. And Luke Ronke played 1 test as a keeper. Tom Blundell has played a few as well. Like, it's actually a funny little scenario, isn't it? Where like Watling starts as a opening batsman, becomes an excellent keeper. Tom Blundell, a specialist keeper, plays a couple times when Watling's out injured, but doesn't get like a sustained run of games until he has to reinvent himself as an opening batsman. And now as soon as that's done, like right at the point where he was probably about to lose his spot to Devon Conway anyway, I think that makes it a whole lot easier, doesn't it? Where you're like, you no longer have to say to Tom Blundell, well, you're dropped, sorry about it, mate. You get to say, well, you're dropped, but your role has changed anyway, because after this series, you're probably just going to be batting at 6 or 7 and be our full-time wicketkeeper in test matches. So I think that makes it a much easier pill to swallow for Tom Blundell, which in turn gets Devon Conway into the test team, and everything looks rather rosy in a funny way. Like it's not, I don't think it's normal to have this kind of easy transition, especially because Tom Blunder was very good. Like he's a very strong wicketkeeper in terms of the fielding side. He's a very good batsman, different kind of batsman, a bit more of a stroke player, or might be a little freer with his hands than BJ Watling tended to be. But from memory, this is, don't know, I could really, I got no, this is unverified chat, but from memory, I think BJ Watling was a lot more of a dashing batsman back in his earlier days. Like, I just remember hearing stories about him clubbing hundreds and stuff, and he sort of restricted himself maybe as he, in order to be the batsman he became in the middle order in test matches. And that is another example of him being against the grain, isn't it? Because most wicketkeeper batsmen these days are quite free with their hands. They do play a lot of shots. You don't necessarily get the guy bringing an opening batsman's mentality to the middle order, where there are going to be a lot of leaves, there are going to be a lot of defensive shots. He doesn't care if he's on 10 off 40 deliveries, after an hour or two of batting. It's fine because he knows he can build an innings from there, and he trusts the partners at the other end. Another crazy aspect of BJ Watling's career is there's the fact that he had two 350 run partnerships. Again, shows how well he was at batting with someone else as well. It's not just batting for himself, it's bringing the best out in others too. Always a very handy trait for sports folk to have in team sports. But he also had, I think, 350-plus partnerships with Trent Boult for the 10th wicket, including 100-run partnership for the 10th wicket. He could bat with Kane Williamson, New Zealand's best ever test batsman. He could also bat with the number 11 in the order and still be able to get that guy to be scoring runs and putting up crucial little runs crucial little contributions late in an innings. There are many facets to BJ Watling's greatness, I suppose. That is another one of them.
This makes the upcoming Test Series and World Test Championship final in England a bit more fun. I'm kind of I thought about this at the time. Roger Tuivasa-Sheck has given the Warriors players and anyone else at the Warriors who wants to chip in a bit extra reason to do something crazy this year. And maybe Roger's given himself reason to go out with a bang and just really do something special. I don't know how, but just through the magic of the world. We have explored how it was borderline magical for the Black Caps to get to the World Test Championship final from whether it's playing cricket in Aotearoa a fair bit. The reason I paused there is I don't know the exact numbers of World Test Championship points they earned in New Zealand and overseas, so I'm not sure, but the way things have gone...
Well, we got maximum points from New Zealand's game, from home games.
But were there more of those games?
There must have been. I can't remember exactly. We had a drawn series in Sri Lanka and we had a absolute hiding in Australia. I think those might have been our only away tours, though, because the Bangladesh tour got cancelled amongst the middle of 2020, and that might have been it. We got to play India at home, which is obviously a huge benefit. We will have, within the course of the Test Championship period, played a home and an away series against England, in which neither of them will count for World Test Championship points, although we beat England when they came here anyway. Yeah, we beat who else? Pakistan and West Indies this summer. There must have been someone else last. Oh, there might have just been the other England series. I can't remember. But yeah, for sure. I think we probably did play more home games than away games.
The one I'm thinking of is that UAE series, but I'm not sure if that was before the World Test Championship started.
Yeah, I think that was pre.
Okay. So regardless, it did feel like everything was kind of building in a beneficial way for the Black Caps to win those test matches and get into the World Test Championship final. And then other shit had to happen that the Black Caps had no control over. Like there was the I think the series that was meant to happen in South Africa, that had a big impact. Just kind of trying to remember.
Australia and South Africa, which got canned.
Yeah, in the maze of cricketing bullshit I've got in my head. So like things happened to put the Black Caps, like to help the Black Caps control their own destiny. Things worked out in their favour just for that to happen, and then the things they couldn't control also worked out in their favour to get to the World Test Championship final. And now you've got a bunch of Kiwi cricketers who, if I know anything, and this is the podcast about not knowing anything, but I do think I know that this Black Caps team will try pretty hard to send BJ Watling out with a World Test Championship, like full stop. I think this is a team, like there's a lot of Northern Districts dudes there who have grown up with BJ Watling. There's players in the Test team like Tom Latham, Neil Wagner, Henry Nichols. Those type of characters have been in the Test team for a long time with BJ Watling. Fairly confident those dudes will want to win the Test Championship final, and it's just add a bit of extra spice into wanting to get that job done.
It's almost like, because the other side of this is the, if that's like positive karma that leads to the Black Caps, like for that sort of foreshadows the Black Caps doing well and being successful in this tour and hopefully winning a major piece of silverware. There's also the dark karma that comes from the last time they went to England to play cricket and the way that the World Cup final ended. And there's, I've still, like, I cannot think of a worse example of losing like one of the major events in your sport. I cannot think of a worse way to lose it than to double tie it and then get it taken away from you on like a random meaningless technicality, because of basically a rulebook that wasn't expecting a game that could ever be that close. So take that in the fold as well and say that maybe the Black Caps deserve a bit of luck after a while, and this is maybe how that plays out, and then you can add another layer of what feels a little bit like destiny, but I don't want to say that because if we lose then it looks stupid.
I think we're going to win the World Test Championship final. I think we're going to win it. I'm going out on a limb, and I'm trying to. What you explained was you got to give to get. You got to receive. You got to give, and if we're getting into real mindfulness, you're receiving just by giving. Like in that moment, you're receiving the power of giving someone something, and I think the Black Caps have given a lot, specifically with that World Cup final. And I think you just outlined why they will win the World Test Championship final. But if you're not able to say it clearly, wildcard, that's okay. That's okay. But I'm gonna take one for the team. Take one for the team and just say that the Black Caps going to win the World Test Match Championship final.
I'm just not so much hedging my bets, but yeah.
I'm not a hero because I'm not willing to say that about the Warriors with Roger Tuivasa-Sheck. I can say it. The Warriors will win the NRL competition this year. I don't feel like it's going to happen though. With the Black Caps winning the World Test Championship final, I can say that they're going to win it, and I actually think they're going to win it. Like there's some sort of ball rolling down the hill momentum that I believe is being generated and is now being bumped along by BJ Watling, telling the world that this is going to be his last Black Caps cricket involvement.
We did beat India in the semi-final of that World Cup as well. Probably the high point of it, their best performance, where it was like a very stacked Indian team was forced to play to the Black Caps' pace and in the Black Caps' style of game, which was not a high scorer. You know, I think it was like scores of 220 odd, and every run matters, and tight bowling, and playing up the pressure. Therefore, but because the Black Caps were in a little bit of control, because this was what they preferred, rather than India probably wanted to come out and score 350. because of that control, you feel a little bit more comfortable against the pressure. So those are all examples that would flow in nicely to a test match scenario against India in the same country. I just looked it up to see what happens if it's a draw, and it seems like they just share it. There are no tiebreakers, which is nice, because I would have assumed if it was a draw, you'd just give it to the top-ranked qualifier, which actually is India, because although we booked our place first, they overtook us on points by smashing England in their last series. But that does leave you in an interesting scenario if it's like, if you're on like day 4 and you're slightly on top, but you don't know if you've got enough time to bowl them out in the last innings, and so do you dangle the carrot and declare a little bit early to try and win the game, knowing that you would share it otherwise, but you risk losing it and getting nothing? It's it's almost one of them prisoner's dilemma type situations. But I think first of all, there's not really any precedent at international level for a must-win test match like that. The only series that ever have that kind of focus are the Ashes, and there aren't too many Ashes games which have gone down to a deciding 5th test. There have been 1 or 2 in my lifetime that I can recall, but it is a bit of unknown territory for both teams, and I guess I would imagine that we get a pretty clear indication of which team is going to win on day 1. I would imagine that whoever starts strongest is going to carry on from that point. Wouldn't expect too many like swings and seesaws and whatever, but again, that sort of plays into the Black Caps' hands, I think. There's a lot of reasons to be pretty confident. I'm not going to do what you just did and come out and say I'm guaranteeing a victory, but I'm pretty glad that you did do that, because that does mean I don't have to. So I'm confident. I don't want to speak it out into the world and then have it come back around.
See, that's usually the case, but the Black Caps are given so much, but also you're just
sacrificed at the altar.
Yeah, and you're just dealing in the Warriors sphere that I explained.
Yeah,
to start the variety show.
Okay, well, we're going to win it then.
Yeah, you're just going with something's going to go wrong. So the Black Caps are definitely winning the World Test Championship final, and BJ Watling is ending his Black Caps career as just a true blue champion, and a legend of New Zealand cricket, New Zealand sports. And I don't think you can choose between Neil Wagner and BJ Watling for their standing in New Zealand sport, regardless of their South African heritage, because you just can't separate them in any way, I don't think. As South Africans coming to New Zealand to play sport and cricket specifically, BJ Watling is the top of that list. Grant Elliott had a moment. I think BJ Watling has had a better impact on New Zealand cricket. I personally believe that. I'm not sure how anyone else feels that, but I put BJ Watling top of the list, and when Neil Wagner retires, he will be right there equal with BJ Watling as South Africans who have come to New Zealand and added to not only New Zealand cricket, but New Zealand sport as well.
There is I don't have the quote on me, but maybe I'll try find it for the variety show or something like that. There was a quote from Ellie Riley, who's Football Friends captain, who has one Kiwi parent and one, I think, Asian American parent, but she grew up in California, so she has an American accent. She did play for youth teams in New Zealand and for New Zealand, but she didn't live in New Zealand in her youth. But there was a quote she gave to New Zealand football or something like that in a profile one time, which sticks with me just from the essence of it, even though I can't remember what it was, about how much it means to her as someone who is not an adopted Kiwi, because she's obviously was eligible through the normal rounds. She's a New Zealand parent, but someone who didn't have the sort of tactile connections growing up to the country from having feet on the land kind of thing. How much it means to her being able to come into that community and be a part of it, and there's an element of because you didn't have it initially, because it didn't necessarily feel like a birthright, you don't take it for granted in a way. That's not really the right term. That's more a metaphorical way to think about this specific situation. But there's a lot to be said for people in that situation of, I'd say Neil Wagner more so because he was in South Africa for longer, and Devon Conway, I suppose, as well, where like, even though you would think there may be their links to New Zealand are a little more, not tenuous, but just not as firm. They don't go as far back and whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not equally as strong. You know, like there's different ways to that these things go, and players in that situation often, it means just as much as to them to represent New Zealand as it does to someone who grew up in bloody I don't know, Christchurch or Wellington or whatever, and been there their whole lives. And what, like, I wish I had the quote from Ellie Riley, but she summed it up in such a eloquent way. It really kind of, I won't say changed my mind on that situation, because there's nothing to be changed, but it really like expressed it in a way which I hadn't heard it expressed quite so perfectly before. I'll try find it for the variety show though.
Beautiful spot to end this week's episode. Thank you for listening, and check out all the good shit all over the Niche Cache on the website, on the podcast, and we'll be back early next week with another episode of the variety show. Kia kaha, stay beautiful, and cheer.